This is the Thayer Podcast for September 12th, 2024. I think we've talked quite enough about COVID, how to avoid it, and how to cope with it. But to date, I don't think we've talked very much about what the effects the government's reaction to it had on our country. To say the effects were small is blatantly false. Let me elaborate. The COVID pandemic had its beginnings, if one can somehow forget all the propaganda that was spread about it, in a scientific laboratory in Wuhan, China. That lab's experiments were funded by grants from the National Institutes of Health through the Manhattan-based nonprofit EcoHealth Alliance. NIH Principal Deputy Director Lawrence Tabak admitted to Congress a week ago that U.S. taxpayers funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in the months and years preceding the pandemic. EcoHealth discovered that bat coronaviruses modified with SARS and MERS viruses had been made 10,000 times more infectious. The virus escaped the Wuhan lab and rapidly infected millions around the world. In response, the U.S. funded and fast-tracked research and development by Big Pharma to find a cure, or at least a vaccine, that could protect the population from the COVID-19 strain of the virus. The bastardized version of the bat virus had the capacity to shut down the human respiratory system. However, the common cold is the coronavirus that regularly and minimally affects people around the world. In late 2020, medicals all over the world were advising people to don masks to protect themselves from the virus. And by mid-2021, governments began gradually imposing restrictions on travel and gathering in public places. Eventually, businesses, public buildings, and whole school systems were shut down, purportedly to suppress the spread of the virus. During the early stages of the pandemic, numerous prescription and over-the-counter drugs were found to stop the virus. But that information was suppressed by government propaganda, eagerly spread by the mainstream media. Eventually, after sometimes mandatory vaccination of entire populations, it was found that mostly the elderly and infirm comprised the majority of fatalities. Most victims, vaccinated or not, developed mild flu-like symptoms that declined in a little over a week. Meanwhile, the result of shutting down travel reared its ugly head. Store shelves were depleted as shipping was massively curtailed, and severe shortages of goods and services were the result. Basic economics teaches us that shortages of goods and services drive prices up as well as the costs to produce them. What happens very quickly we all recognize as inflation. Initially, and up to the end of the first quarter of 2021, there was very, very little inflation. But as government regulation took root, vast shortages of shipping, goods, and services drove the cost of money and everything associated with it through the roof. Inflation since 2021 has reached a total of 21.25%, which means that what cost $100 in 2021 now costs $121.25. For doubters of the numbers, which were provided by www.usinflationcalculator.com, allow me to elaborate. 7% inflation in 2021 drove $100 worth of goods and services up to $107. 6.5% in 2022 added $6.96 to the total, making it $113.96. 2023's 3.4% added another $3.87, driving the total to $117.83. And this year's inflation of 2.9% so far has added another $3.42, making the grand total $121.25. Now, keep in mind the fact that those numbers are spread across the entire spectrum of goods and services. The worst effects of overzealous regulation caused by COVID have been in energy, transportation, housing, and food. Improvise, adapt, overcome. Simplify.